Hello and welcome to the Car Care Ride Reviews channel, and welcome to the 2024 Genesis G70. And in today's video, we're going to do a proper technical review under the hood. We're going to take a look underneath it, inside it and outside it, talk about some things we like, some things we do not like, right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood. Now, this is actually a rear-wheel drive orientation that was adapted for all-wheel drive, which is pretty cool and interesting. Now, you do have two engine options with this car, the G70. You have the V6 3.3 liter turbo and the 2.5 liter turbo. They dropped the 2.0 some time ago. Now, since this is the one we tested in our tester here, this is the one we're going to talk about, which is the 2.5 liter four-cylinder. Let's start with this mechanical construction. This has a plastic valve cover at the top. This does have a two-piece cylinder head. It does have dual variable valve timing. The intake is electronic, so you have a little motor that spins the inside of the gear. If you spin that electric motor faster than the cam, it's going to advance the timing. If you spin it slower, it's going to slow to the timing. It's going to retard the timing. If you spin it at the same speed, it's going to actually spin at base timing. Pretty cool design. We're seeing a lot of manufacturers use that. That's only on the intake. On the exhaust side, though, it's just hydraulic. The little actuator in the front, super simple, nothing to it. This engine does have two timing chains. One of them is the main one that goes from the cams to the crank, does have an internal hydraulic tensioner. The other chain is for the oil pump, which sits a little bit to the side, does have a little chain and a little spring on a guide. That's a pretty common design in the automotive industry. Very basic, very simple. This engine does also have a gear-to-gear drive balance shaft through the crank. Speaking of the crank, the main caps on the crank, they are integrated in this big housing, which is the stiffening case, so you don't have individual main caps. They're just one unit that sits in, and that's the main caps. Now, the cooling system on this engine is very basic, with one small quirk. So you have a thermostat, everything is normal there. You do have a mechanical water pump, but for reasons beyond me, actually, I can understand why. We'll talk about it. This engine has two drive belts. One of them for the alternator and the compressor, and does have a little tensioner. The one for the water pump, which sits on the other side of the engine, is a stretch belt, the least favorite belt on the planet. The reason for that is, if you look in the front of the engine, they had to add the liquid to air intercooler in that area, so there's no way to use the same belt to go to that, so they decided a stretch belt. Speaking of the liquid to air intercooler, this is a turbocharged engine. It does have a decent sized turbo that is oil and coolant cooled. It does have an electronic wastegate. It does have a liquid to air intercooler, so it's all new school, if you would. Now, the liquid to air intercooler, in my opinion, is pretty cool. It sits right in the front, because this is a four-cylinder and this engine bay was designed for a V6, so we have a lot of room around it, which is very nice for service. So you have the liquid to air intercooler, and on top of it, you have the water pump for it, which usually they bury this somewhere where you can't see it. This one is right there. Takes you no more than 15, it'll probably take you longer to drain the coolant than to change it, should anything go on with it. So that circuit is actually a separate circuit than the main circuit. Has its own radiator and whatnot. It has its own coolant jug and whatnot, but that's how they did the turbo here. The fuel system is actually dual injection, so you have port and direct injection, so we're hoping that carbon buildup is not an issue with this engine. Now, the transmission in this car is an 8-speed transmission. It is a torque-converter transmission. To me, it looks like a German transmission, which we will look at in a bit. It doesn't specifically say that it's German, but design-wise, it kind of gives me that impression. Now, this transmission does have 4 underdrive gears and 3 overdrive gears, with 5th gear being direct drive. This car does have an all-wheel drive system as an option. So the way that works is the transfer case is on the passenger side, and the drive shaft is also on the passenger side. The front differential is on the passenger side, and then the driver's side axle goes through the oil pan, through the engine, to go this side. This is a pretty common design with cars of this configuration. Nothing really about it, but something that is pretty cool about this car. First thing is, look how much space you have in the four-cylinder model. There's a lot of space, folks. This is mechanics heaven right here, because you can access every little thing. Wide open space. We love that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm noticing a little bit of an increase in quality with this engine. For example, you don't have miles and miles of cheapo plastic stuff. There is a very distinct coolant pipe on the side. It's a steel pipe. You don't see that. This should be a giant piece of plastic. That's usually how new cars are. This is a solid steel pipe. I love that. Now, there are a few things here to talk about. You notice the gleaming absence of the battery. We'll look at the battery location in a bit, but actually is in the trunk in a very interesting location. Then the liquid to air cooler sits right in front of the engine because, of course, you have all the space. This was meant to have a V6, but if you notice the coolant fittings that sit on it, it's a proper hose with a proper clamp to a plastic fitting. If you could lose that and just put the clamp directly, that would be better, but I suppose we could live with that because looking elsewhere, things are well here. They're actually above what I expected from this engine, which is pretty cool. Let's take a look underneath the Genesis G70. Everything is covered up in the front with some pretty interesting stuff. So we have these bolts, and then we have this little lonely clip. I don't know why we couldn't put a bolt there, but we have a little lonely clip. Let's look at the front suspension because something is very interesting here. You have a McPherson strut design at the top, which does go through the knuckle. It's an aluminum knuckle. But then if you look at the lower, these are dual control arms with 2 ball joints. Usually that is done to make a car handle better, and that it does. It does do well. But the tie rod is steel. These are aluminum, which that's what they deemed it. Then we look at the massive brakes here. I mean, these are Brembo brakes that became standard here. They are massive brakes for this, which is very nice. 18-inch rotors in the front. Moving away from that to the transmission. Something tells me this transmission is German. I couldn't find any info about it, but a couple of giveaways. First, this pan. It's a plastic pan, very interesting looking pan. Just say made in Korea all over it, but just if you look here, the bell housing is actually one piece with the transmission body. That's usually a German transmission special. They love to do that. Equally, the drive shaft, you notice this because this is an all-wheel drive, so the drive shaft goes from here to the front, but interestingly, this has U-joints. Usually you'll never see that in a car of this style. You'll see something more like this, where it has a flex disc or kind of a joint. This has literal U-joints, like a truck. That's just how they deemed it. Something interesting, the exhaust is actually decent quality until you get to right around here, then kind of goes downhill. But this section is really nice. It does have a flex pipe though, so I wish this was not here. Big brace here for the transmission and the transfer case, aluminum. Interesting to see that, pretty big for the size of this transmission in this car. Everything else is pretty well covered. When you come to the exhaust, things kind of start falling off quality-wise here. Rear differential is pretty big differential. Of course, this is a rear-wheel drive biased car, so you're going to have a bigger differential than usual. Huge axles. I feel like at least maybe the same axles for the V6 model. You do have a saddle tank right here. It goes over everything. That's what you expect in a car like this. Let me look at the rear suspension. So aluminum knuckle, multiple steel arms, double wishbone. Here is something interesting about it though. You do have a dual piston caliper here, which is a Brembo caliper. But because the Brembo calipers don't have a built-in parking brake, they actually have to pull this little actuator here, which pulls the cable, technically, in the rotor hat, and that's how you get parking brake. So you got one here and one here. Pretty interesting setup, but it's kind of, you have the bad of both worlds. You still have the rotor hat stuff and the shoes and all that mess, and then you have an electronic part. So that's kind of interesting how they do that. But again, this car is starting to show its age and stuff like that, the afterthoughts. That's how that looks like. Then we come here to a very strange thing. I mean, you can't fit a spare tire here. It's just a little protrusion here. Very interesting. And then the mufflers are also very wide, and just even as wide as they are, it feels like they don't fit very well. And of course, the ends here are wide open, both sides. The manufacturers love to do that. So yeah, that is the G70. Let's take a look at the outside of the G70. So there's something about the G70 that is very interesting. It's an old design, and they kind of updated it throughout the year to add their new face, so it doesn't look as proper. If you look at other Genesis models in 2024, they look like they were designed with this 2 slashes here, 2 slashes in the back. This one, not so much. For example, look at this. So you got these two, which are kind of odd looking, but look at this. How it comes into the fender, making the fender this very weird shape. That is a total afterthought of design. They just had to add it later. Then we look at the hood feature. Actually, I kind of like this. Notice this line that comes here, and then it literally wraps around the logo and then comes back and does the same thing. Kind of an interesting touch, gives it like an interesting profile. Radar sensor is right here. That's, at least it's not very low to the ground. Going around the side, it has a very, how should I say it, a very infinity look. That's how I'm gonna call it. It looks like a G37 or however you want to call it. Nice wheels, nice little vent here. This gives it a little bit of character, but there's not a lot actually going on the side of this car. As we wrap around it, we see the same thing. Now the tail lights almost remain similar to the previous, before the update, but you can see they tried to integrate the two lines. They kind of matted the middle part. Still doesn't feel like, it feels like it was added on later. And then over in the back, you only have Genesis G70 and all-wheel drive. Doesn't really tell you this is a 4-cylinder or a V6, which is fine. Trunk is not power, but it has shocks that open it up, which is nice. Pretty decent sized trunk for this segment. Then we look inside the trunk. Oh, look at that, old school. Remember that big hump we looked at underneath it? If you actually remove this, that's where the battery is. Pretty interesting place for a battery, and a lot of elaborate body change for a battery. But hey, it's actually a decent place for it. If you ever have a leak here, that's where it'll collect. But interesting spot for a spare tire. Interesting truck. Folks, this particular one doesn't have power trunk, but it does have really cool shocks that actually push the trunk up, which is nice. Overall, the exterior, it's nice, but I feel like it does really need an update, and that's kind of going to become the theme of this review from here on out. And this is where things slightly fall down. Not completely crash, but slightly fall down. The minute you step into this car, if you've been around other Genesis models, you immediately feel like this is not on the same level. This is definitely a drop down. The reason for this is an old interior that they tried to update throughout the years, but it's seriously starting to show its age. And this being a sports sedan, the interior is very important. And this one, starting with the materials, I mean, they're not bad. Everything is put together well. But it doesn't feel like a luxury car at this price point. Now, the price is not terrible, but still, let's put it this way, it leaves more to be desired. That's what we're gonna say here. Steering wheel controls are very basic. You do have the volume and a rotary dial, which is really nice. Everything is clear and doesn't take you much to get used to it. The gauges, there's one physical gauge, and then a little screen kind of extends into the next gauge. But when you're driving, the font is really nice. It's just a classic font for luxury cars. And the gauges do go opposite of each other, which is pretty cool touch. But basically, the second screen wouldn't have been necessary. If there was two gauges and a little screen, would have been perfectly fine, but that's what they went with. Shifter is one of those strange shifters. You know, you have a park button, but it's not the worst with the little rotary dial, so I can live with that. But it literally takes the exact same space a regular shifter takes, so why don't we just have a regular shifter? Don't know about that. Now, the HVAC controls, they're not physical button, but they have their dedicated screen with everything there. So I can actually live with that. That works. On top of that, you have some shortcuts for your infotainment. Speaking of infotainment, it's been updated over the years, but it's still not the latest from Genesis and doesn't have wireless Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and it is a little bit on the slow side, especially when you start it. Eventually it gets better, but starting to show its age, and that's the theme with this car. Everything is starting to show its age. I mean, entry and exit is a little bit difficult. If you're taller or if you're a little bit bigger, you will hit your head all the time here. The driving position is pretty comfortable, decent visibility. The seats, once you get in, they are actually pretty comfortable. The ride is, for the most part, insulated. Not the quietest that we've seen in some Genesis models, but this being kind of on the lower end of the sedans, I can expect it not to be at the same level, but it's smooth. But when you hit bumps, it can be jarring. After all, this is a sports sedan. It's not really tuned to be ultra insulated. No, the steering wheel feel is really nice. It drives pretty nice, but it's not the most practical, as you'll see when we get into the back seat. Let's take a look at the back seat, and this is where there's limitations. This is a small car after all. This is my driving position. I'm 5'7". I don't really have a lot of knee room. If there was not these cutouts in the back seat, my knee would almost be at the seat. It's a small back seat, and equally it's a very kind of a bucket style seat where it has a dip in it. Makes it very uncomfortable because you sit down and your knees are up. It's just not a very comfortable back seat. That has to be said, and whoever decides to sit in the middle will feel like the king of the hill because they will sit very high in their head. There's not a lot of headroom here. This is not a big back seat, which is understandable, but here's one thing that I just don't understand, the copy-paste effect of manufacturers love to do. This is the furthest thing from a chauffeur-driven car you will ever be in the luxury car segment. I can move this seat from here. We have controls, so you can have this as a chauffeur-driven car. Why would they do that? They literally copy-pasted that from other models. Because if I was somebody that will buy a car that I will have a chauffeur drive it, I'm gonna send that chauffeur home and buy me something a little bigger, more comfortable for luxury, because this is not one of those cars. Let's put it this way. Let's talk about some things I do not like about this car. And for the most part, I actually like this car because it's really trying. It's keeping things simple, but giving you a smile here and there. The problem is, this is technically an enthusiast car. It's a performance sedan, not high performance sedan, but a sports sedan. Let's put it this way. Problem is, when you open the door and step in it, you get a different vibe. If this was an everyday car, it would be fine. It's a little bit of an older interior, but for an enthusiast car, the interior could be better. It's not that it's not made well or whatever, but when you look at other Genesis models, this starts to really trail behind. That's the first thing. Second thing is the engine choice. This should have only had a V6, not the four-cylinder. Nothing wrong with the four-cylinder. I actually love it because it's so, as we talked about, so easy to work around it, but it just doesn't feel, it makes a lot of power with the buzzy noise and just the way it feels. It's not fitting of this car. The V6 feels a lot better. And lastly, and this is kind of not the problem only with this car, it's a problem with Genesis across the board, they lack the heritage. They haven't been around for a very long time. They're slowly building on that heritage, but people usually will buy these not updated or overdue for an update or soon to go out of production model because of the heritage, because hey, it's time to get one before they're gone. I don't think if we cancel this, I don't think anybody will even notice. That's the problem. Now Hyundai, they're kind of sister company, or however you want to call it, they're starting their heritage with the N line, and they're doing really good. Genesis needs to do something like that, and it's cars like this that could start that, although this really needs an update, big time. So should you buy a Genesis G70? Folks, this is a really tough one, and one that is tough to put a final thought on in one single sentence. So let's break it down in pros and cons. Pros are, this does have a slight old school feel. It is subtle, it's not over the top, but at the same time, it drives well for an enthusiast small sedan. Suspension tuning is decent for kind of a sports sedan, if you would. It handles well. It's not the top, but it's not the worst, and given its price, it's actually not a bad deal. Transmission, even though it's a torque converter transmission, it is pretty smooth, pretty responsive. It's not the best transmission, fastest transmission in the world, but it's not laggy and slow and kind of falling behind. The engine, however, is a different story. If you get a V6, we're good. But the 4-cylinder, while it has a lot of power, it just feels buzzy. It kind of intrudes on the character of this car. Service-wise, though, this is a simpler engine. It has a lot of space around it, and that is the nice thing about it. Now, the interior, the minute you open this door and you walk in it, you immediately can tell this is an older design. I mean, you look at the G80, for example, although it's a lot more expensive than this, but it's kind of the bigger version of this, supposedly. That feels a lot different. That feels actually very nice on the inside. This starting to show its age severely, and the little update they tried to tack on, they're just also starting to show their age, and it feels like kind of copy and paste stuff. We're trying to put stuff. This needs a major refresh, and the biggest problem with refreshing this model is this segment is slowly going away. There's not high demand in this segment. There's so many good cars in this segment, and still the demand is low. We saw the Kia Stinger, which is very similar to this. It got discontinued, so this may be on the shopping block here, folks. The good thing is, to buy it new, it's a little bit on the expensive side, but you can easily buy a 2-3-year-old one, which is basically exactly the same, with a few minus some of the visual updates, for a lot less. And that's where I think the value is, because this is not a terrible car. It's average, it's mid-pack, mid-grade. Reliability-wise, it's also mid-grade. It's not the worst materials used, but they're not the best either. Mid-grade, that's what I would put it. But overall, it's a decent car to drive for someone who's young, maybe doesn't have a big family, because the back seat is a little bit compromised if you're tall. But overall, it's a decent car, but just be prepared. You step into this, things will feel old, and not in the good old-fashioned way. No, they'll just feel outdated and very different than all other Genesis models. They end up updating this, it might start to regain some traction, but currently, it's not looking like the case. So there is that. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.